Said he had a hunchback, but he hasn't.
His car got towed, right.
Now he did kill the two princes in the tower, but my thinking is he didn't.
You are a fan of Richard III.
I am.
I'm a fan of Richard III, okay?
Well, history was rewritten by the Tudors, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
Propaganda! Propaganda!
Fake news.
Yeah.
Do you know, in years' time,
Nothing changes.
in years' time, people will be saying things like, oh, David Cameron was a firm supporter of Brexit, and look at the end result he had it. You know, these types of lies that we see continually sort of done in the media. And throughout time, Richard III is one of those figures in history that we can say a lot of positive things about if it wasn't for the writings of a certain William Shakespeare.
Yes.
Terry, I'm so glad we agree on this today. So what we need to do, we need to look at a few images, don't we? And what's gonna happen, right? Lynn, focus on the screen.
I am.
Just focus. Lynn and I have got this understanding, right? Do you see what happened then? It's already working. Lynn, what we need now is we need a bit of the hang on. If we just get that there, it's gonna work. It's going to expand. If we get a bit of it expanding. What's going to happen? Okay. And we go. Bingo.
And if Kathy had been here, she would have said, turn the lights out.
Bloody witch. Sorry, Lynn. I thought you had that title. Anyway. Right. Okay. So here we go. There's Richard III. Isn't he an attractive looking man? Terry's ideal bloke. Isn't that right, Terry?
Not exactly.
Don't like his long hair.
You don't like his long hair?
No.
This look, if you look a little bit at forget
Is that a little
Right.
goatee beard he's got there?
Pardon?
Is that a little goatee beard he's got?
No, it's not. It's not a little goatee beard.
It looks
No.
like it from here.
It does.
It
Ginger beard.
He hasn't got a ginger beard.
What's he ginger?
Yeah, let's have a vote on it. Who says he's got a ginger beard?
Me.
No, it's not a ginger beard.
Yes, it is now. We've just rewritten history.
Yeah,
You've rewritten the history.
we
Right.
decided.
Okay then, right, let's rewrite it. Right, if you're going to rewrite history, you've got to do it properly.
Got a ginger.
Yeah, it's got a ginger beard.
That's not a beard!
What is it then?
Shadow.
It's just
Background. Yeah.
thank you, Dennis.
Just fluff. He's only young.
Bloody hell, I tell you what, you are hard work. I tell you what, most of you are special needs. So join the club. Right, okay, so what I would like to do now is I've got to make sure that Lynn, do your thing again. Bit of a problem at this minute. Right, so Richard III, as we do know, reigned for just around 2 years, and his reign itself, you could say, was insignificant in history. And what I'm saying by insignificant in history, if you forget about William Shakespeare, it's likely that Richard III would have been lost in the annals of history anyway. He was a king killed in battle at Bosworth. His reign for 2 years. To be honest with you, the two princes in the tower, they would have just fallen away in history. Nobody would have really known about it. And in a contemporary sense, Richard III was never accused of the killing of the two princes in the tower. It was William Shakespeare who wrote about Richard III. And like many things in history, those who eventually write the story, because that's the point. That is the real point. I didn't realise this until that second. The real point is nobody really wrote about Richard III. Nobody was really interested. So William Shakespeare thought, oh, who am I going to write about? And he thought, right, hang on a minute. There's this little story about the two princes. There's a king with a few sort of weird skeletons in his closet, maybe, even his own. And I'm going to write that story. And then it would become Richard III, that wonderful work that William Shakespeare is one of William Shakespeare's best works, to be honest with you. They say it's Macbeth and so on, but if we look at Richard III, he's portrayed in popular theatre and cinema as having a hunchback, withered arm, and having a very evil menace about him. However, in some of the paintings that we've got surviving at the time, it's not the way William Shakespeare has it. So what we have, if we look at Richard III, born on the 2nd of October 1452, and he died on the 22nd of August 1485 at the legendary Battle of Bosworth. And the reason why it's a legendary Battle of Bosworth, it's one of those points in history that sort of ends this war between the House Lancaster and the House of York. But to be honest with you, the war was more or less over anyway at that point between those two houses. And this upstart comes in, Henry ap Tudor, defeats Richard III of Bosworth, and then history sort of more or less continues on. Bosworth wasn't a massive battle really. The casualty figures weren't huge. And I'd like to remind you of that. That the importance of battles, one or two battles of history have been overemphasised. Bosworth being one of them, and the other one being the Battle of Culloden. In fact, the casualty figures at Culloden were actually pretty low. And did most of you know that Bonnie Prince Charlie's, most of his army survived? And a few miles further down the road, Bonnie Prince Charlie and his general sat down and said, right, we've got 5,500 men, should we continue the Jacobite rising? And they all decided no, and that was it. It wasn't the great slaughter at Culloden that we're told, and it wasn't the great slaughter at Bosworth that we're told. What we do know at Bosworth is the one that is defeated, the one that is slighted greatly, is Richard III. He's the great casualty of the battle. And the Roman 9th Legion was not there, Alan.
Was the conjecture over the battle site?
There is always conjecture over every battle site. The problem is with most battle sites is that this is another key point as well. Battle of Hastings. It's not actually at Hastings. Do you know what I mean? And the Battle of Shrewsbury is actually sort of outside Shrewsbury, and the Battle of Tewkesbury isn't in Tewkesbury itself. There's actually sort of a mile away. You know, Bosworth. It's sort of in the Bosworth area, but it's not smack bang on that locality. And the thing is, when we're looking at history, like the Battle of Watling Street, got the Romans in there. What Battle of Watling Street? We don't know where the Battle of Watling Street actually was. The Roman battle between Boudicca and Suetonius Paulinus. We don't really know where that was. But most battles in history, we really struggle to understand where they were because locations. Pardon?
North of Lancaster.
So you say.
The commemorative area for Bosworth isn't the actual site.
Exactly.
Because you could stand on the commemorative bit and they say it's over there.
Exactly. It's a bit like Hastings. You go to Hastings.
Stones and they've got the seats.
Exactly.
Exactly. Set up and they go, yes, but it's not here. It's over there.
Exactly. So what the best way to sort of look at Richard III is to sort of give you a little bit more information in the background. So obviously we've mentioned William Shakespeare a fair bit already, but this isn't a lecture about William Shakespeare. Oh, and if we want to talk about real figures in history, did William Shakespeare write all his work? There you go. Ooh, there you go. There's a good old cackle. Karen?
They don't even know who he really is.
Exactly. When his brother Edward IV died in April 1483. So now we've got a timeline. 1483 to the 22nd of August 1485. So we've got a very small timeline. Have you noticed that lots of the figures who are famous in history, Joan of Arc, Boudicca, were almost were there for a very short period of time. Yeah, they had these major events. These things happening, and the major event for Richard III was actually William Shakespeare. Again, Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm for his eldest. Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm for Edward's, his brother's eldest son and successor. Okay, so his brother Edward IV's eldest son. Richard III was meant to be his protector. A 12-year-old Edward V. Now, Edward V, it said, sort of reigned for a little bit, and then more or less Richard III took over. Now, it can be said that a 12-year-old is not old enough to decide anything, let alone rule over a country. And it's typical, say in the case of Edward III, for example, that there would be a Lord Protector, that there'd be somebody else to reign in their stead. And some could say that Richard III was actually reigning in his nephew's stead, for example, Edward V. So we're trying to make sense of this. Before the king could be crowned, the marriage of his parents was declared invalid. Now officially illegitimate. Their children, the children of Edward IV, were seen to be those that could not reign over the country because they were illegitimate. So that was not passed by the king. That was sort of passed by the Lords and Parliament. So they basically said, "Look, Richard, do you want to become king?" That's one story. There's so many stories about this. We could go on all day. And even in Richard III's reign, there are other people who say that they could be king or queen. And there's this constant blag over who should be reigning over England at that time. And then in comes Henry ap Tudor in August 1485. And those that know anything about this, they will know that Henry landed in West Wales on the 7th of August, and by the 22nd of August, he was at Bosworth. 22nd of August, Richard III was killed. Job done. History changes. Richard was slain, making him the last English king to die in battle. Henry ap Tudor then ascended the throne, and then we have another mark in history. The mark in history is that we've now got the House of Tudors, rather than the Plantagenets or the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Henry, had this new king, Henry VII, Henry ap Tudor, was supported by the French. Most uprisings are supported by the French. Most invasions are supported by the French. And the last one, you could say Culloden. The French supported Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. And a few other things. I'm not going to go into the great detail about this, but there's some debate over where Richard III was buried. Now, this is a very interesting story. We're going to sort of abridge this bit. It was said that depending on which route you go, Leicester itself could be 5 miles away from Bosworth, 6 miles away from Bosworth, or whatever, right? But it's said that his body was buried at Bosworth, then it was moved to a local church, and then it was moved somewhere else, and then eventually it made its way to the car park at Leicester, which is absolute nonsense. The reason why it's absolute nonsense is because when they found the body, his little finger digits, his little phalanges are all still intact. So if you're moving a body, the first things you're going to lose are the fingers, and then you're going to lose the toes, and other things are going to be lost. And also you're going to lose those parasitic worms as well. And it's said that his body was dumped in the river and it was washed and all these other things. And anyway, the body was taken from Bosworth more or less within a few days and then moved to Leicester and was buried in state. Well, it makes sense because one of the stories about what happened to Richard III at Bosworth was that his body was collected on a battlefield, was dragged on the back of a horse, 7 miles, it's not going to last, so move that one. He was placed on the back of a cart with his hair trailing over the back, and at that point he lost his beard, with the hair trailing over the back, and then he was occasionally stabbed by people as he's going towards Leicester. He's already dead at this point. Basically, those that saw the death and the aftermath of Saddam Hussein and poor old Colonel Gaddafi, you will know that after the person's dead, they're insult wounds. People stab them, kick them, chuck a slipper at them or something. These are a way of people getting their own back on the king, knowing full well that the king's not going to vent retribution. And then at that moment he disappears from history. But there's a lot of really interesting things about this. And I'm going to have a go at all of you. And the reason why I'm going to have a go at all of you, you have deprived me of something today. If only I had one volunteer to put those press curtains together in order for me, I will have been able to rip out the archive from August 2012, the original press cutting, and the one the next day, and the one the next day, but I couldn't find them because none of them are in order, and nobody will help put that archive together. See, Keith, you've got loads of time. You've let everyone down in the room.
No, you take Dennis up to your place, don't you, every Tuesday? So he could do that.
Hang on a minute. Hang on. In Dennis's defence, Dennis does other things for me.
Does he?
Yes, he does.
We haven't heard that before. We had our suspicions.
Yes. Do you know, you've got a good way of turning things around. Anyway, back to those press cuttings. So I remember teaching in Cowbridge that day, and it was August 2012, and I was teaching there that day. And somebody handed me a press cutting, and it said, body thought to be the remains of Richard III found in a car park at Leicester. And the first thing I felt was, if they're saying it might be Richard III, it is Richard III. And then it said at the bottom, Leicester University. And I thought, oh, I did a few years in Leicester University. And I just thought, let's try and work this out. This is a university saying that they might have found Richard III. But by saying they might have found Richard III, they had found him. Because what I'm talking about is, for years, King Arthur's found every few years, isn't he? He's found here, and he's probably been found under the church at LANGFORD Major a number of times. And lo and behold, it turns out that it's never King Arthur or something. On the ground straight away, Leicester University had all the experts in there. They had the radiocarbon experts, they had the metallurgical experts, they had the osteologists there, they had the full expert team. In fact, you can imagine, right? Set the scene. An archaeologist thinks that in this car park, in the middle of Leicester, could be the remains of Richard III. They know, for example, that this is the site of the Grey Friary. Okay, and the first place that they dig, strangely enough, they find a body, and the body actually turns out to be Richard III. The first thing that they actually do is find that. And I went home that day with all this, and I thought, actually, my university had known that body had been there for 20, 30, 40 years, right? And it was one of those archaeological finds that was in reaction to something. I know full well that the archaeology department at Leicester was struggling at that time, and they needed more students for their archaeology department. And guess what? The next year they had the biggest intake of archaeological students probably this country has ever seen, on the back of the finding of the body of Richard III. Okay, they made that find that day. Not only did they know the body was in that location, they knew the specific location, and they'd always known. But it was all part of that bravado, and all part of that play acting that most of us archaeologists do. They already knew it was Richard III, and it took another 8-10 months of publicity to get to the actual fact there actually was. So this was a great thing, seeing this thing unravel, knowing how archaeology works, knowing what archaeologists do, knowing the deception the archaeologists use, and this was the greatest example of it. But the finding of Richard III was significant, because very few figures in history have ever been found. We haven't found Joan of Arc, except that's because most of it is under Ellen's bed. We haven't found Joan of Arc. We've done Joan of Arc. We've found Otzi the Iceman, but Otzi the Iceman was nobody important in history. But most of the figures that we have looked at, we don't really find their bodies. King Arthur, Has his body ever been found? Don't go there. Most of these figures in history, the bodies are out there, needed to be found. So, what we need to do is look at a few more images. And if we keep going, I'll mention the Romans again in a short while. And whilst they were excavating in the car park, they may have found Roman material as well. And again, they may not have. You see what I did there? Right, so Richard III, that's a facial reconstruction, right? So here we go, look at the skeletal remains of this man, okay? So what we would do, just we take the skull out of there, skull's there, right? So we take a mould of your skull, right? So we've got a nice cast of your skull, right? And then we're going to reconstruct your face.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we do, we know the levels of where the sinews are and the muscle and the fat and all the rest of it on your face, because each of them has a standard measure, and then we put the skin on there. We have a perfect reconstruction of what Keith looks like, Richard III. And we know from the descriptions that some of the descriptions say that he had black hair, so obviously black eyebrows, dark eyes as well, so that makes sense with the reconstruction. We know that he had no facial hair. Note, no facial hair. That isn't a goatee, okay? It's the image. And this is a very, very good likeness of what Richard III looked like. And if we sort of move on gently there again. Oh, shut up. Oh, shut up. Doesn't look like Shrek at all. All right then. Okay, fair enough. Right, anyway, which rose is this?
It's a white rose.
Oh, it's a white rose. Oh my God, you are so good today.
Yorkist white rose.
Yeah, it's a Yorkist white rose.
White rose.
White rose. Now, I remember doing a lecture a few years ago. I was talking about the red and the white rose and the Plantagenets and the Tudors, and what we see is the red rose being the Lancastrians and the white rose being the Yorkists. That makes sense. And when you see an amalgam of these, it represents the two houses, the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, sort of as the Plantagenets. And then the Tudors, then you have the Tudor rose, which is a unification of the two. But it could be argued that that was already there anyway. The fact of the matter is, the rose itself is said to have been worn by the soldiers of Richard III at Bosworth. That probably couldn't be, that's slightly far away from the truth. The truth is that they all wore a boar. Richard III was the boar of York. These were the boarists. They were represented by a boar. And one thing that we look when we look at William Shakespeare is that the boar is slain. Boars should be slain and butchered and poleaxed and all the rest of it. Exactly the same thing has happened to Richard III. But he also had something shoved up him. But we will also look at that in a short detail. Not in the same way as happened to Edward II. So there we go. There's the skull. There's the reconstruction, and you can't see it. You'll see it a bit more clearly. But there's a cut mark on his skull, and the rest of the damage to his skull is at the back of the cranium. And one thing is this. This is repeated through history. What you've got to do with the enemy who you have killed, you've got to allow their face to be intact. You could debauch the body as much as you like, but the face has to be intact. So you can actually show people that you've actually killed this person. So most of the wounds were to the back of the skull, and other parts of the body, particularly the buttocks. But that's after death. So if we look at this, if I can give a few little bits of information.
How old was he when he was killed?
32. He was 32 years old.
He has got a cross, like, it's real Jewish for the fold in his upper.
If you spoke up, Ellen, we could have heard
I
that.
can see that, Alex.
What's that?
Like
Anyway.
Class 3 occlusion is lower jaw further forward than his upper. Normally, it's the other way around.
Right, okay. It's good, Evelyn.
So that picture should be, his lips are level, but they shouldn't. His lower lip should be a bit further forward.
Yes, because it's not much. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that should be a bit further back, shouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, no, it's not. That's how he is. But what I mean is the picture of him on the left. They should have his lower jaw further forward, so his upper and lower lips aren't level with each other.
Right. So you're saying he's got smaller lips than he should do?
No, the position, it should be like this, look.
The lower lip should be
Yeah, they shouldn't
extended
meet
out.
because
right.
his teeth don't meet.
Right, okay, fair enough. So, right, okay, here we go. Let's go on to my notes. So, here we go, discovery of Richard III. In August 2012, by February the 4th, 2013, it was announced, there was a 99.9% probability that they had actually identified Richard III. But again, this was all part of the play acting by the archaeologists. So, Richard III, rediscovered. Human remains found beneath the Leicestershire car park. Those was Richard III, as we've already worked out. Detailed osteological and genetic analysis has confirmed that the Greyfriars individual is the lost king. A sample of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the female line, was extracted from a tooth and compared to samples from two living female line descendants of Richard III's sister, Anne of York. This revealed a match between the family of Richard III and the skeleton. Radiocarbon analysis supported this identification, returning dates that the body itself dates from somewhere after 1455. So it's not far off. Radiocarbon dating isn't always as accurate. Sort of, it doesn't specify on a direct moment. But what radiocarbon dating does, it sort of puts the body within a time frame of 20, 30 years. So that's where the dating is. The other thing as well is we'll look at another little schematic plan of the fact that Richard III, there's a male Y chromosome descendant as well. So that's rather interesting. So we know that he had an aristocratic high protein diet, particularly rich in marine foods. In a way, you could argue that marine foods were actually the food of the rich back then, and not the food of the poor. Because lots of the vulgaris, the poor people, had suspicions about the sea, because those little fishies out at sea eating away at the dead of mariners. So therefore, we don't eat fish, but they're good enough for the rich. Don't ask. Lots of people in the medieval period would prefer to die than eat fish, but the aristocrats ate fish, so that's why they continue to live on. Examination of the king's remains had laid to rest some of the popular myths about Richard III's appearance, which we'll go on to. Although he suffered from severe scoliosis, a sideways curve to his spine that made his shoulders slightly uneven, he was not a hunchback, so he didn't have a huge hunch on his back. Nor was there any evidence of a withered arm described by Shakespeare. He was just sort of a bit of a stoop, and he was able to use his sword arm to wield a sword, which is really important. He's not this sort of complete idiot that William Shakespeare makes him out to be. Osteological analysis also shed light on Richard III's brutal end. Again, we'll look a little bit more about this. Something discussed in some historical accounts. We don't just have 10, we have 11 wounds, mostly to the back of the head, inflicted with a bladed weapon at or just after the time of death, and a halberd, which we'll also show you about in a short while. 3 glancing blows to the scalp had shaved off thin slivers of bone, while a 4th had punctured the top of the skull. 2 more wounds to the back of the head, cleaving away parts of the skull, would have killed the king almost instantly. There are also other signs of damage to the body as well. The team also found evidence that Richard Richard's remains were mistreated after his death. Now, do you know when you actually do research like this and you sort of think, oh, actually, they actually found a metal arrowhead in his spine as well. I didn't actually read that anywhere. I found one source, and you don't actually see that. Actually had an arrowhead in his spine as well. Bit like the one actually found at Maiden Castle, the ballista bolt. 1 second. Go on quickly.
Was that an old injury or the time of death?
The ballista, not the ballista bolt, the arrow in the spine. It's. I don't think, to be honest with you, he was wearing armour. So we can do suppositional evidence here because we've got soft tissue in the spine as well. It might be very difficult to work out when that was lodged in there, but I would say it's unlikely that wound was carried at the time of the battle. So very interesting point there. We can't go any further with that, Ellen. And the other way, because he had scoliosis anyway, it may have actually hit already damaged nerves, and it may not have needed to be removed. That's a really interesting point. But unfortunately, you know what? I don't know any more than that about that issue, which is a shame, really. But maybe if anyone comes up with any more on that, but you know the information's out there, good. You won't find that many places. Best place to look for information about that is Google Scholar. Somebody may have written a paper about it. So these other cuts, we've got cuts to his rib. So obviously that would have been plated with armour in battle. So at that point the armour's gone, so there's damage to one of his ribs. And the right pelvis, indicating a stab or an insertion of a halberd through the back and through his buttocks. So in other words, well, we don't want to do too much play acting. I hated this bastard, and you get the halberd and you smash it right up him, right? Which would be the greatest insult for a king, right? Which was the greatest insult for Edward II, but unfortunately, Edward II having a hot poker thrown up him, he was alive. These were seen as humiliation injuries, very important, being inflicted on his corpse. To be honest with you, if you want to do comparisons, you could say that reburning Joan of Arc's body is a humiliation wound again. You're having to burn this bloody witch over and over again. In a way, it's humiliating her soul. But back to Richard III, it is a humiliation as a wound. Historical sources describe how the king's body was stripped and carried back to Leicester for public display. But there's one fact we need to look at in a second. Slung over the back of a horse. One fact I'm going to tell you in a second. His body was slung over the back of a horse. A perfect opportunity for an onlooker with Lancastrian sympathies to inflict these final insults. Little translation. As Yorkish king, he tried to unify the Lancastrians and the Yorkists under one crown. He didn't reign long, so obviously the Lancastrians, being the sort of losers in this, were the ones inflicting the wounds. But when the Tudors come over, it was like the Lancastrians and the Yorkists were the Tudors' enemies anyway. But anyway, it's something else. There is one thing about this whole story which I've not read in any literature. When I do this lecture in my other classes, we explore these other issues by the time it gets to you. And one of the issues was as follows. It's very strange for me that this individual was thrown off his horse, for one, his white stallion, whatever colour horse he had. He was thrown off his horse, for one, and he was there laying on the ground. Now, if you look at other examples in history, this figure would not have been killed because people would have known he was a king. And also, if they thought he was a knight, they would have wanted the knight to have lived, to have actually bartered him, he's a hostage, a ransom, anything, right? So the unusual thing is, he's on the floor, writhing in agony. Well, you would writhe in agony if you'd been tossed off your horse, whatever. But they kill him. Now, this doesn't make sense. No orders of the day would say that you kill the king. You're a bog standard vulgaris. You're a plebeian soldier. You shouldn't be killing a king. You've got no right to kill a king. So that's an unusual area of the history. Why he was killed in the first place. If you go back to the lights, go back to this point, okay? This is a very important point, if you can level with me on this one. On the 11th of December, in the year 1282, Llewellyn ap Griffith was killed at Kilmary, right? He was killed by Adam de Frankton, who eventually settled very near here, Frampton Manor. And it's always said that Adam de Frankton regretted killing the last Prince of Wales because he was not a king or a prince killer. It was not the thing to kill kings. It was not the medieval etiquette to kill kings. It was somebody else's job. So that's the unusual thing. Why he was killed in the first place is, I don't really understand that. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, perhaps he fell off his horse, banged his head and he was killed then.
No, you're missing the point, Jim. That's not the point, Jim. Keep that with yourself. The point, the Chris, can you just do your bit? I just go on, Chris.
I was going to say, Henry Tudor was leading the Lancastrians, wasn't he? So I would imagine that he had to kill Richard III because otherwise his claim to the throne was very tenuous.
Some of the Lancastrians, not all of the Lancastrians. Because as I said, it's the Lancastrians at the end of the day weren't part of his house, but some did support him. You are dead right there.
Did he
Yeah.
marry Elizabeth of York after to consolidate?
Yes. His sister. Those points are obviously after at the time. The one point to be made here is that it said that Richard III was heading towards Henry, right, on his horse, and he broke away from the rest of his army. That's what's said. So but then again, Henry's men, by the etiquette of the time, shouldn't have killed the king. You know, it should have been surely somebody higher than them to have killed the king. This is the point I'm trying to make, all of you. This is the point I'm trying to make. So it may have been that something that identified him as the king was lost, and then you chuck in the crown. Apparently the crown was found in a hedge. When we were children, we were always told that his golden crown was found in the hedge. It was lost as he was tossed off the horse. In the absolute confusion of battle, he may have lost his helmet. Some of his, obviously, the damage to his head is caused without his helmet on. The big question is why he didn't have his helmet on. And because all that was lost, it could have identified him as just a very low status knight, and then he was butchered to death. And only then did they realise that this was actually Richard III. His face was intact, so all the damage was done with him face down, and nobody was able to identify him in the fits of battle. If he had fallen upright, maybe, just maybe, he could have survived the battle, but we don't know. Ellen.
Is that fracture across his face actually a sword blow?
A sword blow, apparently. But again, I'm struggling to find anything. Lots of things about.
Four was a surgeon who wanted to work out how to mend people after they had a fractured face. So he got dead people and swung them around by their ankles and smacked their heads into the wall. So there are LANGFORD, LANGFORD, three classic fractures of a blow to the face and the resulting facial fractures. So it could be if you had a facial blow, then this
Yeah.
came up from
That could have been the blow that caused as he came off the horse. That would make more sense. But again, the identification of this individual on the field. Further indignities were revealed by the excavation itself. And obviously we've got a lot more to go with this today. But the indignities revealed was that the king, even though he was granted the basic rights of a Christian burial, he was it's said in my notes, he was hastily buried in a grave that was sort of quickly prepared for him. Right? There's one problem with this. He was buried in the chantry, the choir of the church. So basically, you got the long bit. You got the monastery, the prior itself, and the Grey Friars at Leicester. So you've got the huge nave, and you've got the choir, and you've got the chancel. Now, strangely enough, when it says here, he was hastily buried in a hastily dug grave, smack bang in the middle of a choir, smack bang in the middle of the cathedral. I step back and I think about that. I think, hang on a minute. I'm not really sure what I'm reading there, because if he's buried more or less in front of the altar in this big building, right? Yeah? Going with me on this one? He's buried in front of the altar, which is a great deal of respect afforded to him. Secondly, he's actually within the building itself. So nobody's going to hastily rip up a load of medieval tiles within a church, get rid of a load of other bodies. That's not hasty work, that's preparation for me. So when people say he was hastily buried, I actually don't agree with that. Because digging up a choir inside a very active, large monastic house, cathedral-like building at that time, doesn't say hasty to me. It seems that, in fact, I would disagree with these notes. I think he was afforded a lot of respect in the point of burial. He was buried in this grave friary building. But the one point I think that I'm not missing is that the place, the reason why they might be using the word hasty is, even though it's being prepared, the tiles are being lifted out, and it's smack bang in the middle of a choir. He's being buried in a space that is actually is actually shorter than his height. So as he's placed into the ground, there's another important point come in. As he's placed into the ground, he's squashed into this space, which is affecting his spine again. So when we do see the eventual image of Richard III, we actually see that it's really truncated. And I'm actually thinking whether it was that truncated in real life. Because remember, he's forced into that space. Nobody examines that either in the information. That's why you come to these classes, to get these little bits of information. But the one thing that we did find, so what I should do really is actually bring you that image. So if we go to that image of the body, we'll come back to all that. Oh, there we go. There's his body. There we go.
No sign of a coffin, was there?
There was no coffin. Oh, hang on.
Which suggests it was, quite a hasty burial.
Right. Okay. Let's just take a bone of contention with this, right? One second. There's hasty, and there's what I'm saying. The space was prepared for him in the choir. That doesn't seem to be hasty, but the size was wrong. So that's one mistake. To be buried without the usual vestments, to be buried without a coffin, and so on. Even though he should have been buried in a coffin, I think it's making too many assumptions.
Maybe it was dug for somebody else, and they hurriedly put him in there before somebody got.
There's another translation. So we got these different things that we're looking at, right? It's your perception, but actually the space that, and actually the other thing, I'm going to turn this on its head, Andrea. It was actually being prepared for somebody else, and that person gave up their space for the king. So we can look at it in another way there. Ellen.
He could have fallen and died and been hunched up with rigor mortis, and then because they couldn't straighten him out, they thought they would just do it like this.
That's another way of looking at it. Do you see, we've looked at so many.
One thing you learned from the mountain rescue, because we had to put a bobble hat and a coat on somebody, because we couldn't put them in body bags, we had to sit them in the passenger seat. Land Rover to bring them back.
No, I can see. So in other words, we chucked in Andrew's bit, we chucked in Anna's bit, we took the text bit, and in other words, there's different ways of interpreting how he was buried in the choir in this religious place. But the facts are, he was buried there. He was buried in front of the altar. Whether he was in a space of somebody else, they had to give up their space. So therefore, you bring back, he's respected to a level. And we put in Ellen's bit there as well. The sense of rigor mortis is a very important thing. Obviously, rigor mortis is well set in by that point. But if we look at this body as well, you've got that hugely curved spine. This is how he was found in the ground. Now, this is a next important point. If he was found by archaeologists who weren't that good at their job, didn't take photographs, didn't plan these things, they may have thought, right, okay, the body looks a bit truncated in the ground, we'll re-straighten her up and we'll lay it out. And people say, oh, he never had scoliosis. You'd see by some of the rest of the vertebra and lumbar itself that there would be decisive signs that some of the vertebra ground up against other bits of vertebra, but you wouldn't be able to get the true degree of his disability. And I don't think we've got the true degree of his disability, as Ellen pointed out. And how he came off that horse would have affected how his body was. And to be honest with you, we don't really know. He could have fallen off that horse dead in the first place. Yeah? That nobody's actually said that he was still alive, writhing on the ground. Nobody's actually said that. William Shakespeare could have said it, but William Shakespeare was 100 years later. So what we need to do is look a little bit more at some of the facts associated with Richard III, and I'm just gonna.
Where's his feet?
They're not there. They've been damaged due to erosion. They haven't been stolen by Ellen. So what I'd like to do, something that I missed out in order on Tuesday, was actually a timeline with what exactly happened with Richard III. But what I'd like to do now is show you the burial place of Richard III, and I'm going to have to gather this back over to me. So here we go. There it is. He eventually was laid to rest in where? Leicester University. And going back to the previous point, to prepare the area at Leicester University itself, and to actually create this monument in the first place, cost £1.3 million.
Why?
This is how much it cost. The burial inside the cathedral cost £1.3 million. Why? Obviously, they've got to move other bodies there. I'm not going there, but that's how much it cost.
Is it marble?
Yes. It is all marble. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you the timeline. Recapping one or two things. August, as we know, 2012, a team of researchers and archaeologists from the University of Leicester searching a grave underneath a Leicestershire car park in the choir of the church of the Franciscan Friary. Grey Friars discovered a skeleton. The press is told strong circumstantial evidence points to the skeleton being that of Richard III. Obviously, they didn't say at the time it was the only body there, and they already knew it was him in the first place, but they needed to sort of get new students into the university.
Why would it have been the only body there?
It was the only body there because he was buried. Again, he was buried in the choir. He was buried. He was buried in one of the most important places in the church itself. One of the very most important places in the church, where there'd be very few other people buried. Hence, again, proving his importance at time of burial. 4th of February 2013. The team tells a press conference that the wealth of evidence, including radiocarbon dating, radiological evidence, scans, DNA, bone analysis, osteological evidence, all the other scientific things, telling us that this is the confirmation, 99.99999% that this is Richard III. That 0.0001 is the fact that he could have been an alien from Mars. It is the academic conclusion of the university that it is Richard III. Now, the point to be made here is it's very, very the not done thing these days for archaeologists to come out and say something straight away. Because I can tell you, as pure experience, people in Orkney, the archaeologists in Orkney knew that they had the first stone circles, the first pottery, the first settlements, the first this, the first that. A decade, 2 decades before they made it public to the rest of the world. But they had to make sure that those facts were smack on. Because so many times archaeologists have got it wrong. But when they've got it wrong big time. for example, a few years ago, I know Jim would probably remember this, when they were excavating at Killeen, I think in 2008 or 9, they were excavating there, and one of the archaeologists said that he'd found a signifer standard head. A signifer is a Roman soldier, is a standard bearer. They said they'd actually found something associated with the Roman standard, okay, and off that there would have been the representation of the Second Augusta Legion. They got so excited, they said basically it was a metal thing with a little bit of thing sticking up. They actually thought it was this, and the archaeologist went on the news and all the rest of it. And it turned out to be a fitting from a shield that wasn't made public because it did what the archaeologist needed to do at the time. Got loads of people visiting, got press attention on the archaeological excavations at Killeen, job done. But that archaeologist was wrong. It's always good to get things right, but when archaeologists are wrong, we very rarely admit we're wrong. So there you go. 5th of February 2013. Now this is when it's completely decided that this is Richard III's body. There's a petition online. One of the early online e-petitions. You know these e-petitions online. Let's vote for Boris Johnson to be removed from office. Those types of things. 12 million people do it and whatever. But this is an e-petition that the government needs to take notice of, because the people of Leicester are not to keep Richard III's body. It's got to go to York Minster. And there's this online fight, isn't there, Terry, between those in Leicester, those in Lancashire, those in York, and also Westminster as well. This time they didn't have it in London. And the people of Leicester, it's saying that the Conservative leader in Leicester says, now this is a fight now in the media, 7th of February, the people of Leicester misplaced him for more than 500 years. Would we really wish to entrust his remains to the Yorkists again? My God, this is a war! Wasn't this dealt with back in the day? The 8th of February 2013. The descendants of Richard III's family want his remains to be buried in York as a matter of justice. Oh no. 13th of March 2013, Leicester Cathedral reveals initial plans for Richard III's tomb. War has been declared. Some 15 of Richard III's relatives, the Plantagenet alliance, oh, they're in on it now. Forget about the Lancastrians, forget about the Yorkists, we're now the Plantagenets, we're all united. We don't like Leicester. There's a judicial review into the decisions authorising his reburial in Leicester. It is announced. The alliance says relatives should have been consulted by the government over reburial. And states it wants a licence that enables the University of Leicester to decide where the remains are reinterred to be overturned. Our king. Okay, the Lancastrian and the Yorkist king, but these are Yorkist king. Our king has to be laid to rest in York Minster. So the Lancastrians and the Yorkists have laid down the mantle. They're together, a unification year. If he's going to go anywhere, forget about Lancaster, he's got to go to York. We don't want the people of Leicester to have him. And it goes on, the 16th of August 2013, there are warnings issued by the Department of Justice. Actually, this is a human body, and it's seemingly undignified and unedifying to be arguing over where this body needs to be buried. This person has to be buried properly. Not after a year, not after 2 years, but hundreds of years. Wherever he's buried, he's got to be buried soon. So Leicester Cathedral, go ahead, right? The body's in Leicester. It's with the archaeological department. And there was talks of it being nicked by people from York, from the archaeology department. But anyway, moving on. So the 19th of September 2030, Leicester Cathedral unveils a design for Richard III's tomb under a plan that would cost the university £1.3 million on a raised tomb of fossilized limestone on a marble base. That really nice dark marble base that you've seen. Members of the Richard III Society's got involved now. Request that their donations not be used to fund the King's Tomb at Leicester Cathedral. I tell you what, this is better than finding a body. This is because at this point I forgot about the press cuttings. Okay, we haven't got those ones. They disapprove of the design, and they do not want the body to be buried at Leicester. If it is buried at Leicester, they don't like the design. Oh my dearie me! So in other words,
above ground, I suppose you could argue it's not buried, isn't it?
Oh, shut up, you tart. The 24th of September 2013, a petition calling for a Parliament debate. Yes, a parliamentary debate on where to bury Richard III fails to reach its signature target. Oh, it needed 100,000 signatures and only 31,000 people signed it. Thank goodness. It's the only petition I've ever known to fail. They always get there. Yeah. Okay? The Let's Knight Tommy Robinson one got to 100,000. 18th of October 2013, the Plantagenet Alliance will have their costs protected even if they lose their legal battle over where the monarch's remains should be buried. So in other words, you've got a Richard III Society, you've got his family, you've got the Plantagenet Alliance, you've got the York Minster, you've got Westminster as well, you've got Lancaster. Forget about Lancaster, they just disappeared on this one. And Leicester University wanted it kept in Leicester. There's another review. It goes to the High Court regarding the licence granted to the University of Leicester authorising Richard III's reburial is adjourned. The court agrees to allow Leicester City Council to make representations as a party to court, and a Yorkshire law firm is now involved. It is frustrating. This should not have happened. The body has to be buried in York. 13th of March, I wish the body hadn't been found at this point. Now, there's another year now, there's 2 years on, more or less. The 13th of March 2014, there's another review. Leicester City Council is now a defendant in the case, alongside the Ministry of Justice and the University of Leicester. So the Ministry of Justice, believe me or not, has more power than the actual police. I've seen it in action, right? The Ministry of Justice are on the side of Leicester. It's going to Leicester. York Minster and Leicester Cathedral are interested parties. It's said by the History Extra, the magazine of the day, 2014. I'm not sure it's still going. Richard III was a culturally significant person, and there should have been a broader consultation about the location of his burial, other than going to York or going to Leicester, maybe Westminster. And this is here we go. And therefore, this has gone on a bit too long now. In March 2014, leading archaeologists have declared that this is not the body of Richard III. The strength of the identification is that different kinds of evidence all point to the same result. But there are archaeologists wanting to challenge and counter these debates over the body. In other words, they need the whole body re-examined, meaning that the court process has to go on. Further, 23rd of May 2014, the court concludes there are no public law grounds for the court interfering with the decisions in question, particularly over the Department of Justice. In the result, therefore, the claimant's application for a review are dismissed. Professor Foxall of the University of Leicester, who was head of the department when Richard's remains were discovered in 2012, we are jubilant. This is a victory for common sense. So in other words, the battle is over, thank goodness. The battle took longer than the 1 hour battle of the Battle of Bosworth. Richard III, there is one good thing about this delay, archaeologically. It meant that the body could be examined for a longer period of time. So in other words, the body found in August 2012 was being examined over a 2-year period.
So you keep the archaeologists in jobs then.
Keeping the archaeologists in jobs, thank you very much. Richard III began to drink more wine and enjoyed a diet filled with lavish foods such as swan, crane and heron from new research in August 2014. So if the body had been buried there and then, we would not know more about his diet. Through cutting-edge isotopic analysis, which was now available in 2014 and not available in 2012, the analysis and the bone tooth material, researchers discovered a change in the king's diet in his later years, from where he was moved at Fotheringay Castle in eastern England by the time he was 7, and therefore he's moved around the country. His diet changes, and he returns back to Fotheringay Castle again. So we know from the diet, looking at his bones, his strontium, his teeth, and all the rest of it, we know more about the body. And this is on the ilk of Otzi the Iceman. On the 17th of September 2014, by new analysis, they found out that he wasn't. There's no doubt there were 2 blows that killed him in some kind of sustained attack. You never know, he could have been still on his horse, we don't know. Using advanced CT examination in 2014. So obviously it was good he was kept out of the ground. On the new CT examination of the 500-year-old skeleton, forensics teams from the University of Leicester showed that they found an extra wound as well. So when I read earlier on, I said it was 10. I said 11. They found that they found another wound to his body, 3 of which were fatal. And by the looks of it, if the first one hadn't killed him, the second one did, and the third one, well, he was already dead, all to his skull. He had nine wounds to his skull altogether, 9. And 2 to the rest of his body. The scientific confirmation of the wounds and detailed research indicate that Richard was not wearing a helmet. So that answers everything. It answers the fact that he was not properly identified on the battlefield at the time, and the damage to his skull was caused by the fact that he was not wearing a helmet. All those wounds tell us that, and that is an important point. So in other words, we can rewrite a lot of what Shakespeare was saying. We need to explain why this was the case, given that all sources point to Richard riding into his final charge with a helmet topped with a crown. But the damage caused to his body tells us that he was not wearing the crown at that time. You could say that they gathered around him, grabbed him, and a couple of blows to the skull, and that killed him. But that doesn't make sense.
Could have surrendered or something like that and taken off his head to show who he was or something.
And they still didn't know who he was. And there is one point.
His armour would have been so intricate.
It would have been. It would have been. Now, say, can we just take back a few of the things we said? Say that these people knew that he was Richard III. I've discounted it that they knew he was Richard III. Say it was Richard III, and there was more of a vengeance against him, as you've so described. But there is one problem with that. Even though they might be able to identify some of his regalia, okay, most people did not know what Richard III looked like anyway. So you've made a very important point there. Say they knew it was Richard III. There's some kind of vindictive thing going on with this king. But the fact of the matter is, he didn't have his helmet on at the moments before he was killed. A very important point. And we're not going to dismiss any of this stuff in the room. These are very important areas and avenues to go into. And the arrow in his spine as well. God, I've been talking for quite some time. So what I'm going to finish this bit. 27th of August. It's said, as I said cynically at the beginning, 27th of August 2014, it was announced by the local tourism industry that that year they had a boost to their economy of £45 million. So you can imagine why the body was found in the first place. That's not being cynical. That's Leicester University graduate. I might know a little bit about this. Local tourism has grown by a lot more than other areas of the country. This is the place to be. 2000 December, new genealogical research proves beyond reasonable doubt that the remains discovered underneath the Leicestershire car park 2012 are those of Richard III. According to a team of researchers at the University of Leicester, the latest analysis, all available evidence confirms 99.999% that this is the guy. The researchers collected DNA from living relatives of Richard III and analysed several genetic markers and found the mitochondrial genome shows genetic match between the skeleton and the maternal, and a little bit when we get onto it after the break, the paternal line as well. And it's said that anybody who had any doubts over this can't carry those doubts forward, because we know beyond doubt. On the 5th of January 2015, they actually found out that a famous actor on the 5th of January 2015, who was playing the role of Richard III, a very unknown actor, Benedict Cumberbatch. Strangely enough, somebody said, well, go on, you're playing this role, go and have a DNA test. So he had a DNA test. And they found out it makes Benedict Cumberbatch a third cousin 16 times removed to Richard III. But then somebody said in another press article a day later, this is how the press works. You have the headline stuff and then you put something a few days later saying it is estimated that between 1 million and 17 million the United Kingdom could be related in some way to Richard III. But we needed to get the news out. Benedict Cumberbatch sells newspapers. Most other relatives would be much lower ordered cousins. 7th of January, it's obviously we're looking at relatives visiting Richard III's site of burial. And one thing is, the site of burial, he wasn't interred until the 22nd of March 2015. There's a procession through from Leicester, leaving the university from the Priory, 22nd of March, and it goes all the way to Bosworth, all the way to the last church that he visited, all the way back around, all the way, and finally on the 23rd of March 2015, there were people in their thousands queuing to visit the tomb of Richard III. So what we're going to do after the break, we're going to do a bit more of Richard III. We got some bit about the parasites in his gut, which again is my evidence to say that the body had never been moved, because the eggs themselves, any movement of the body, gut would have come out and so on, and that would have been left where they buried him initially, and the bones would have been moved and so on. He was buried once and that's it. So are there any questions?
At what point?
There's always one from you, Jim. Go on.
I was thinking you were saying about not many people in history have found bodies, but at what point can you dig people up? So I mean, say Karl Marx in Highgate, 100 years' time we're digging up, it's Karl Marx.
Hang on a minute, if they put HS2 through Hyde Park Cemetery, we'd be able to dig him up. But which is a fact really. At which point there's never a point that we can't identify these bodies in archaeology. I've got to say that as an archaeologist. Keith.
Do your flies up.
And it's taken an hour and 15 bloody minutes for one of you to tell me. Thank you very much for that.
Well, we thought we'd see how long it took you to realise yourself, but you didn't.
We were transfixed.
Some more than others.
Right, 2 questions and I want a break. I want to die with embarrassment. Ellen.
If the Leicester University knew about it 30 or 40 years ago, why didn't they say? And why did that woman say, when she was saying, oh, I've got a feeling he's under the R in carpark, why did they come up with that story then?
Well, you can work it. Right.
Seems a bit floriferous.
The one thing I can say, the archaeologists have a history of finding things suddenly, right? If you've ever watched Time Team, I love Time Team, but one day I was watching Brief Archaeologist on a site in Somerset. And when I was watching Brief Archaeologist on this site in Somerset, they'd found these wonderful medieval remains, and there was some prehistoric stuff there. I went to chat with the director, and he said, we had Time Team here a few weeks ago. What would Time Team were going to do? They were going to come here, and they were going to film Time Team here, and every now and again they were going to find stuff that was already found. That's the way sometimes Time Team worked. And usually, if you've noticed on Time Team, they always found something on the last day. Sometimes that was genuine, sometimes it wasn't. Most archaeological excavations I've been involved, something's always found on the last day. That's the way it is, right? Because things getting intense in the last few moments. If you look at the discovery of Howard Carter's Carter and Tutankhamun in was it November the 3rd, 1922, when that body was actually found. Howard Carter had already known it was there for a decade. When he was threatened the fact that he was going to lose his job next week, he suddenly found this tomb. It's really weird. The one thing that can be said is that there's no way in the world that Leicester University didn't know the body was there. But I think supporting Leicester University, it was more that the science was there in 2012. That it hadn't have been 20 years earlier, and I think they waited for the science to catch up. When I say cynically, Leicester University needed the students. They're a really good archaeological department, but the fact is the next year they had the biggest intake of archaeological students that this country's ever seen in an archaeology department. So if you link all these things together, it's deliberately poised for that point in time. But if you want to look scientifically, 2012 was the time to find the body, because the science was there to categorically prove this is a good way. 99% there is the body. So they're not going to have egg on their faces. Bingo. Quickly.
Well, simple question. What is a halberd? Is it halberd?
Well, we're gonna look at that. I know. Wonderful. Ellen has held one. A halberd is a large shaft which is about that height.
Right.
And what it is, there's a piece of metal with a sharp spike one end, a little spike this end, and sort of a blade this end, and that's what a halberd is. Yeah. And we'll show you that. And they're actually quite tall, aren't they, Ellen? They're really tall. No, you're not bringing one in next week. Right, we're going to break now, and what we need is Alan to get a knife, and we're going to cut this cake.
I've got a knife here, I've got cake as well.
Oh, fuck it, cake.
That cut ran it over.
Cake, that's what Richard did.
We'll all have cake, look. We'll all have a bit of cake.
We'll have 2 bits of cake.
We'll have 2 bits. Right, okay, right. Here we go. You know what, right? I need a bit of string. You know that knicker elastic, Gillian? Can I borrow it off you? So, yeah, I need to do my trousers up. I can have my revenge on you lot one day. I'm not going to let that stand. Particularly Jane. Jane is usually quite amiable in telling me these things, and she didn't. She let me down, the witch.
I didn't actually notice.
I did. What do you think I feel then?
It's better to be told eventually, isn't it?
Do you know what, right? I've got this slate that John
I'll get a cup of coffee.
Excuse me.
If somebody could make me a drink, I would be very, very grateful.
We went to the
Oh,
the oldies section.
Oh, yeah.
Chocolate.
What do you want?
Oh, you see?
Eh?
Do you see what happened then?
Yeah.
What do you want? Like a proper bloody creep. I'll have a cup of tea, lovely, loads of milk. No sugar.
That's it.
That tends to make its own now.
God, I'm taking it out without me tea bag.
That's a life history.
You know, isn't it different without Kathy here today?
On the stage. God, wow.
Everyone's got out the bloody
And
room.
then she got signed up to NGN. And it was them that started her off on the drug thing. Because she was playing the part of Dorothy and they were filming over in like 18 weeks. They wanted
Is that screen any good for your uses?
Oh, it's perfect. We used it. Unfortunately, that's why I put the hicks up there. But the bloody problem is I forgot to bring it this week.
Oh, right.
No, we
Wow.
what it was last week,
And given her
because I didn't have any things in place to mount it on.
God.
We tried it over on the corner and it didn't work. And then somebody said, "Why are you having it on the door?" And I think, well,
Yeah.
any stupid idiots just barge in a room. They're supposed to knock anyway, so if anyone wants to leave the room, I'll just take it down.
It's quite light, it's quite easy to manage, isn't it?
Well, no,
That's why I've done it back, 'cause I bought, it's the wrong size, that's what I did, I bought the wrong
You
size.
know, it's all film
Oh, right.
And then by the time I put it where I wanted it, it was too small, so I thought,
Oh, no,
it might be good
no,
for
it's
you.
appreciated.
I sent it back.
No, it was good for me. That's why we're using it next week.
Yeah. And the, I've only got back last night, so I'm all a bit all over the place
Well, I
today.
suppose so, yeah.
There's the
so
scanner.
she was screwed up.
Which? Oh, right.
Now,
Yeah.
do you want that, or do you want to give it a try? I think to make more today.
If you're getting rid of it and it's any good, we'll put it down the studio.
That's what I thought.
Well, I won't use it. I'll use it for Archaeology Company.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
But we had it working on Windows 8, but when they did the last update,
I still got Windows 8 computer.
yeah. But when they did the
The one
last
I'm using is
update,
10.
I found a fiddle to get it working on Windows 8. But when they did the last update, it was working on Windows 8 again.
But you know, the fact they got away.
Well, we'll
And now
try
my
it.
husband's got a Windows 10. You don't know
So
that.
they give it drugs.
I got no one with Windows 10, but yeah, I got Windows 10. It's a terrible system. Do you know what? I got Windows 10. I use a Chinese operational system because I can't use it. I
It's
don't-
worth a try.
Oh no, yeah. I use an operational system from China called Kingsoft.
Yeah.
It's as good as Word, but I don't have the hassle.
If not, I am getting rid of 2 printers. I don't know where my computer upgrade in the office. But one of them's going to my ex-husband.
Takes that
But
tip
that's
about
a
the
scanner
flour.
printer as well. That's a normal
That takes
scanner.
the tip about the
The thing is, I need something down the studio because if I
yeah.
if I don't get it down the studio, I can get
Brilliant.
this
They are
stuff.
really
Well,
good.
yeah.
It's usually
Well, I did offer to come and help sort print.
Yeah, that's the trouble, but there again, you don't
You
use it
sort
often.
of
I know.
and I got
Did
it.
I?
Yeah. I did.
Oh well, if you come down to Barry on a Wednesday, if you can, let me know. Have a word with me at the end. I didn't. I don't know where I was. I'll have a word with you. Did I? I think she must have got me on the off. I had a flashback once. I realised.
Yeah, we saw it again earlier.
Which flashback is this?
I know.
But I say, you know, you just think,
Is Chris both going?
For my tea.
We might have to have one and take one home.
When I said to Michelle about this role, she said, "What's new?" Oh, this lovely role.
Yeah, I didn't realise that was big one.
No, we're right. Okay, then what we'll do, we'll all have 2 bits of cake each. Gillian needs fattening up. Look at her, she's like a balsam
home with
victim.
us like a party
What?
Yeah, the milk's there, Chris.
They banned you from Balsam, didn't they, Gillian? They said you were an embarrassment to the Third Reich.
Do you think that archaeology departments and certain universities are holding back certain information?
Of course they are.
So that they can have these fines to raise money when they're finding funding.
I've got a list of things.
Oh yeah.
Shall I take the spoon?
I've got an underground souterrain in the Vale of Glamorgan that was found a decade ago, which I'm standing on until I need some publicity.
Where
Do
do
you
you
think it's
put the tea
ethically
bags now?
right?
In the bin.
Oh, right.
What is ethically right? Archaeologists are not ethical, as you well know yourself. Who dares phone me in a lecture? Evil bastards! Oh, mind my phone, sorry.
Don't talk to them about Michelle like that.
No, I called Michelle an evil witch. That's fine. She's not an evil bastard. I love Michelle, you see. She's just an evil witch. I tell her to her face as well, after she's chucked a few things at me.
Frogs and
I know I am absolutely dreadful at cutting, so I can't very volunteer.
Oh, hang on a minute. Oh, Christ, that